Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we're outlining the doomsday scenario that the Iranian regime is only weeks away from nuclear breakout, and yet the world is silent. Well, welcome to the program, and as you can see, we have a new set for the new Jewish New Year, and I'm joined by my good friend Robin Benson from the south coast of England. Robin, it's great to see you back in the studio, and thank you so much for helping me out with so many of the Zoom programs, and it's good to see you in the flesh.
It's great. It's good to be back, Simon. Thank you for the opportunity to come into the studio. And
Robin, we are facing, sadly, what I can only describe as the doomsday scenario, that the Iranian nuclear crisis is the biggest foreign policy issue that has dominated the past 2 decades. And now we could only be a matter of weeks away before the Iranian regime achieves nuclear breakout. And if we actually thought that the crisis in Afghanistan was bad, then this is a very dark and dangerous scenario that we face. What is your assessment on what is happening in terms of how close the Iranian regime is to nuclear weapons?
Well, as you and I know, it's a constant. It seems actually at the moment to be a constantly changing and ever diminishing number of days and/or weeks. If that people are saying that Iran. I just pointed out to you a headline I saw on my mobile phone in the last 5 to 10 minutes. That Honest Reporting, which is one of the major media outlets connected with Israel, is reporting that the International Atomic Energy Agency is now saying that Iran could be up to a maximum of 1 month away from having enough nuclear material to make a bomb, which, just sends a shiver up and down my spine to think of the implications that will flow out of that very real possibility.
Can you share with us the magnitude facing Israel and also the free world at the prospect of the Iranian mullahs achieving their ultimate goal, which is nuclear weapons? And I think we need to put in perspective that this has been a story and a development that's dominated our news for the past 2 decades, and yet our mainstream media are silent on this. Where's Boris Johnson? Where's Dominic Raab, our Foreign Secretary, talking about, warning about the dangers of Iran going nuclear? This should be the #1 foreign policy issue that Joe Biden should be dealing with on his desk in the White House. And yet it seems like the world is asleep. And even Israel are struggling to get their point of view across about how dangerous this situation is, because it is a game changer. Once the Iranians have nuclear weapons, there's no going back from this absolutely frightening scenario that we would all face, that all of our lives would be in danger.
Yeah, and Iran actually doesn't actually have to use it. All it has to do is make sure that people realize we've got at least one and threaten to use it. And that in itself is a game changer in the Middle East, if not anywhere else, because it will put those Arab nations, particularly the Sunni Arab nations, who are either frightened of Iran or opposed to the Shiite malocracy that is in charge of Iran, it will put them on notice that they are under threat, for starters. And some of them will collapse in the sense that they'll collapse into the arms of Iran. They will pledge allegiance to the Iranian regime. And I think one of the things we have to be very careful here, Simon, in this discussion, is that we make a difference between the Iranian people, who for the most part hate the regime that's over them, and the regime and all of its security apparatus that keeps itself in power. And this is what we're discussing, those who are actually in power. But if Iran gets the bomb, yes, there's the threat of using it. Israel is then under threat as well, because that's the central focus of Iranian hatred outside of its hatred of the states. So Israel is then put in a position, if it even allows Iran to get that far, and it's a big if in present circumstances, but if it allows Iran to get to that point, Israel will be put in a position where it has to respond. It cannot not respond. It must, for its own safety's sake and its own security. And I mean, you and I do not want to be doomsday sayers today in this discussion. But really, when you sit down from a human perspective, okay, God, the God of Israel that you and I follow, that you and I worship, is sovereign, but there are things that he is allowing to happen in the Middle East and the rest of the world as well in these days. So if Israel is put in that position, it will respond. And the domino effect of that in the Middle East and then spreading out into the rest of the world, in some senses, really does not bear thinking about. We are talking potentially of World War III, including nuclear exchanges here. That's the reality of what might happen in this scenario.
So let's paint a couple of scenarios for our viewers, and I think we need to point out what Iran having a nuclear weapon would mean. Firstly, they're an Islamic Shiite autocracy, and they have a totalitarian regime. So the first thing is that we could see that previous Iranian presidents like Ahmadinejad, the supreme leader of Iran, Khomeini, who holds total power in Iran, say that it's the objective of the Iranian regime to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. If they have nuclear weapons, they will have that capacity to do that. They've also said that they want to create almost an Armageddon-style scenario in which their Shiite Messiah, the 12th Imam or the Mahdi, will return and set up his world government under Shiite Sharia law. So this is the first thing we have to be alarmed about, that we're not using Cold War analogy of mutually assured destruction, that if the Americans fire a missile, the Soviets would fire one back, and therefore the threat of nuclear annihilation prevented them from ever pressing the red button. We don't have that scenario with the Iranian regime. There's a great danger then that the Iranian regime would then give nuclear weapons such as a dirty bomb to Islamist terrorists that would blow up New York, London, Paris. So there is no capital city in the Western world or throughout the world that's actually safe. And then the other great danger is that this will lead to a nuclear proliferation in the region, the world's most dangerous region having nuclear weapons. Is just a frightening scenario. So we know that we are completely living in prophetic times, but combined with the fact that we have incredibly weak leadership in Biden in the United States. We've seen this with his total chaos and total mismanagement of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, combined with the fact that he's done nothing to support and protect Israel. And again, we see that this crisis, he's asleep. So these are all the dangers that we face. We see that Israel has a weak government and leadership in power as well, and that any Israeli retaliation against Iran's nuclear facilities would unleash probably the greatest wave of anti-Semitism that we've seen since the Second World War. So we're looking at an extremely dark scenario, are we not?
We are. And I think one of the things that probably frustrates you and I the most is that most of our politicians in the Western world will not, in any shape, size or form, bring into the mix what you've already pointed out, the Shiite apocalyptic theology that is driving particularly the leadership in Iran. It is their desire to see the Mahdi return. And the scriptures that they base their understanding of that upon say that that can only happen in total chaos. So they are quite prepared to unleash total chaos upon the world in order to further this aim. And I said it before, I think, to you on this program, for me it beggars belief that there is at least not a faint recognition that this is part of the overall driving force in what is going on in the Middle East at the moment on the part of our politicians. It's like they are totally woke. They are totally afraid to bring religion into the mix, into the political diplomatic mix. And therefore they cannot get their heads around what is driving these people forward with this plan.
And there's no leaders with any moral clarity on
No, sadly not. I mean,
world.
that's another factor in all of this, that we have a leadership here in the UK, we have a leadership certainly in Washington, D.C., that is just bereft of any moral base whatsoever. And as societies, we are paying the price of that in the mess that we're in.
Absolutely. So let's go and have a look at this excellent CBN news report warning the world, and the world needs to wake up to the dangers that the Iranian regime could only be weeks away from having a nuclear weapon.
Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is sounding an international wake-up call.
I'm
calling on world powers. Don't fall into the trap of Iranian deception that will lead to additional concessions. They are dragging on. We must set a clear-cut deadline that says, until here. The Iranian nuclear program is at the most advanced point ever.
Israel remains clear. Its military option to strike Iran's nuclear facilities is open. Earlier this month, the UN agency monitoring Iran's nuclear program released a confidential report saying for months the regime hindered access by damaging surveillance cameras while also expanding its nuclear program dangerously close to a weapons-grade level. To avert a political showdown, Iran invited the agency back this weekend, but it could be too late. Meanwhile, Sunday, Israel's defense minister issued another warning with the release of images of an Iranian training base.
The Kashan base, located north of the city of Isfahan, is used to train terrorists from Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Iran has developed proxy terror, which is perpetrated by organized terror armies, which are assisting Iran in achieving its economic, political, and military goals.
The camps include another weapon of terror, military drones.
One of the most significant tools employed by Iran and its proxies is UAVs, with a range of thousands of kilometers. Hundreds of these UAVs are spread across Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Iran is also attempting to transfer the know-how needed for UAV production to Gaza.
Seth Frantzman, author of Drone Wars, says this is Iran's war of the future today.
What it tells us is Iran's not just exporting the drones and the blueprints. It's bringing people into Iran, training them, and then setting them back. And I think that's a big implication for the region, because it means you have very skilled operators who can use drones to target ships or energy facilities or whatever they want.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Quite a frightening scenario, the prospect of the Iranian regime having nuclear weapons. What concerns me the most, though, I think, about all of this situation is that our world's media is asleep. Here is a massive geostrategic news story, Robin, that our mainstream media is not reporting. And, this has been building up for at least a couple of decades now. And we're only weeks away, and yet where are our mainstream news channels not reporting this massive geostrategic news story that would completely change the balance of power in the Middle East? It would make the world a more dangerous and precarious place. And also the unpredictability, what the Iranians would do if they had a nuclear bomb.
Okay, but you and I turn on any of our major media outlets when it comes to either their midday or their evening or their late evening news broadcast. What is the number one issue that they're talking about? COVID-19. It is still, over 18 months later, dominating our news cycles, to the point probably that a lot of folk, I suspect, may not even, like me, don't even bother watching the news most of the time because we're fed up. So that has become the dominant story, certainly in the Western world. How are we dealing with COVID? What's the next crisis? What's the next mutation? Is it going to be bad? Can the vaccines cope with it? All of this and the ripple effects, you know, empty shelves in our supermarkets, fuel not being delivered to, you know, petrol pumps, and everything to do with that. This has become the dominant story in the West. Secondly, you have the whole issue, as I mentioned before, that our politicians seem to be scared stiff to bring Islam into anything to do with what's going on in the Middle East, even though it is the dominant religious force in the Middle East. You know, whether it's Shia, Sunni, it doesn't matter. But don't be seen to be criticizing Islam. And then there's also, I think, the factor, probably in your research, my research for this program, there is the distinct sense that, particularly from the current American administration, they're literally trying to buy off the Iranians, you know, appeasing them whatever way they can, in the hope, the vain hope, that it will bring them back to the negotiating table and that they'll be able to work some sort of cobbled together revision of this JCPOA 2015 nuclear deal. And the crazy thing is, Iran has never signed it. They have never signed up to the jolly thing in the first place. So I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not a politician, I'm not a diplomat, but when you read something like that over and over again, I ask the question, why on earth are we even negotiating with them? If they won't sign the jolly document, you know, how can you actually believe a word that they say that they will keep to it? And it's been proven, you know, the Israelis have proven to us that they haven't kept to it anyway.
And what is even more disturbing is the fact that under this agreement, they'd still have nuclear breakout by the year 2025.
Yeah,
so we're now 21, so that's 4 years away, and it's only delaying the inevitable. It's not stopping their program.
We know already that they're just weeks away, if not days. So I mean, even the 2025 section of the document is now irrelevant. It's a complete and utter waste of time.
Absolutely. Talking about the Biden administration, it seems ever since that Joe Biden took hold of the presidency, and his foreign policy has been an absolute disaster. I think even Obama was very much concerned about his judgment when it came to foreign policy decisions. The fact that he then said, for example, that he wants to re-enter into the Iranian nuclear agreement with the Iranians, that he's actually taken the Houthis in Yemen off the terror list. He's literally parked Saudi Arabia under a bus, and actually, as you mentioned prior to this program, removed their
Patriot missile
protection, which means that the Saudis are now at the mercy of the Iranians. The fact he wanted to restore diplomatic relations with the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, which then led to the horrendous violence and rockets and missiles attack by Hamas that we saw against Israel in May. And now we've seen his absolutely disastrous US withdrawal from US troops from Afghanistan, leading to the collapse of the Afghan army, with the Taliban taking over Afghanistan, which has empowered all the dangerous Islamist terrorist organizations across the Middle East. And America looks weak, and this has undermined their credibility and their faith in NATO. So we see the security of the world just literally disintegrate before our eyes. And now the biggest foreign policy challenge facing his administration is that the Iranians are weeks away from having nuclear weapons. And what he's trying to do is just trying to allow the Iranians to dictate terms. I mean, they just appointed, the supreme leaders just appointed a new president in power with blood on his hand, a judge that was responsible for the death of hundreds, if not thousands, of Iranians, and is adopting a more hardline approach than the previous president and government. And yet the Biden is saying, okay, we'll wait. You guys we'll wait 2 or 3 months before this government gets into swing of things and before they get everything functioning and working together, which is complete lies, because the supreme leader, Ron Khomeini, runs the entire show. He runs their nuclear policy. So again, this is the Iranian mullahs laughing in the face of Biden and his foreign policy team.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I hate use the expression over and over, but it beggars belief. I can't fathom as Joe Blow in the street, what on earth is going on in the White House? I mean, you have to wonder at the increasingly wonder at the state of mind of the current president. But setting that whole issue aside, many folk have pointed out this is Obama Mark III. This is Obama's third term, because what we have is predominantly Obama appointees back in the White House pursuing almost exactly the same policies that the two actual Obama administrations pursued. And what we're seeing unfolding in the Middle East is an outplaying of that reality. And some of the decisions that are being made, you have to ask yourself, I mean, do these guys, these men and women in positions of great power and influence, do they really understand the ripple effects of the decisions that they're making and of the things that that are obvious to any normal person, that they're just denying hook, line, and sinker? And honestly, we were talking before we started recording this, Simon, and the only conclusion that I can come to when trying to look at it from a biblical perspective, which I think is important that we try to do that with some of these issues, is that Romans 1 verses 28, 29, 30, 31 is coming into play, where God says through the Apostle Paul, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind. In other words, they've just lost the plot to do what ought not to be done. They are filled with all manner of unrighteousness, and so there's a whole a long list of sinful behavior. It's like America, as I think we have to some extent here in the UK, has stepped over a line in the sand that God has drawn, that only He knows where it is, and He's just going to let them run with it. He's allowing this administration, sadly, to take the most powerful nation on the face of the earth and flush it down the toilet in every sense of the word. Economically, diplomatically, politically, socially, the whole shooting match. America is just going down the tube because we have an administration that God has removed any sense of restraint and any sense of protection over. God has removed that, and we are seeing that played out in the crazy decisions or lack of decisions that this administration is taking. And the ripple effects of that is going right out across the world, certainly with us here in Western Europe. And our government is probably just as befuddled and puzzled as what's going on in the White House as anyone else, who's watching the news or picking up a newspaper or wherever they get their news from these days.
Or the other aspect we can bring into this is the fact that either this is absolute sheer incompetence on behalf of the Biden administration, and let's make it clear that Biden is not running the show. He's not making the executive decisions because he's not capable of making those decisions. So the question is, who's actually running the United States? But it also could be a deliberate policy. And this is Obama's policy that would actually empower the Iranian regime, and that the American administration are not going to take any military action to prevent Iran from achieving nuclear breakout, which effectively means that they've already reconciled themselves. They're going to live with Iran having nuclear weapons. Yeah. Now, that is just a scenario that is so dark, you can't really even comprehend it, because the security not only of the Middle East is a threat, but the security of the Western world is a threat. Iranians have intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach London, and it wouldn't take very long for them to actually put a nuclear warhead on one of these missiles and fire it at any European capital. Yeah. There is also an alliance they have with Venezuela, what's to stop them shipping missiles like the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62 to Venezuela, and therefore these nuclear missiles would be targeted at American cities. So we're really seeing a kind of complete breakdown of the traditional post-world order that emerged after the Second World War as America as the leading powerful force in the world. And once, as a nation, you no longer stand for anything, and let's not forget that the United States now under this administration is so far removed from its Judeo-Christian heritage, they have no moral clarity. They no longer see good or they see evil because those waters have been blurred, which brings in confusion and darkness and danger. So this program is a real wake-up call, isn't it? That we need to wake up, that we need to be spiritually alert to the times we're living in, but we need to pray and intercede because the days are dark, and Iran gaining nuclear weapons is a scenario that is not even worth comprehending how serious and dangerous the world would be in if this happens.
And there's also the factor that actually America is eating itself from within. I mean, the society is falling apart because of wokeism and everything, that's connected with that. So the whole societal basis has been undermined, and it's crumbling and falling apart. Now, there may be individual states that will fight back against this. There's even a clause in the Constitution, I think it's the 10th Amendment, that gives them some leeway to do that. But whether they've actually got the willpower to challenge the federal government is another issue. But I think we also need to bring into the mix the fact that Turkey, Russia, and China are also not on the periphery of this, they're actually meddling in all that's going on in the Middle East at the present time. You've got Russia and China, lining up to get involved in Afghanistan. And you've got Turkey and Iran, who are opposing ends of the Muslim theological spectrum, and yet when it comes to certain issues, particularly Israel, they are willing to work together because Israel and the United States are the common enemy. And again, the whole purpose of all of these nations is to undermine American world dominance. But the sad reality is, Simon, that the Biden administration is handing it to them on a plate because of this isolationism as far as the Middle East is concerned, what seems to be a fixation with the sort of Indo-Pacific region and trying to battle against China. I mean, the whole thing has just become such a complex picture. And yet when you boil it down, as you've already said, the core of it is Iran. In the center of all of this is Iran, with its tentacles, like an octopus, reaching out and infiltrating into so many of the nations in the Near East and the Middle East, seeking to undermine them and to pull them under its umbrella.
Absolutely. And also we have to understand or talk about the approach of the US administration, desperate to appease the Iranians, desperate to resurrect this failed nuclear agreement that President Trump consigned to the dustbin, or you say the trash bin, primarily because he felt that this had too many loopholes. I mean, it addressed none of Iran's missile defense program. It discussed nothing about Iran's abuse of human rights or sponsorship of international terrorism. So it's incredibly dangerous that Iran is now so close to achieving a nuclear breakout, and yet our Western governments, our Western media, our intelligentsia is asleep to this danger, and just as they were asleep to the implications of the way that Biden withdrew US troops from Afghanistan, and the world was shocked and horrified that the Taliban took control of Afghanistan over 20 years. And then we're seeing the same situation unfold now with Iran. And, and it's a big if the Iranians have nuclear weapons, unless we see intervention, and there's only one nation that's going to intervene, and that is the nation of Israel, because Iran poses an existential threat to Israel's existence. They threaten to wipe Israel off the face of the earth with nuclear weapons, and there's only one small little state in the Middle East that's going to say, no, we need to stand up to this. But sadly, they won't have the backing of the US administration. The Arab states are now scared about the Iranian dominance and influence in the region. They might not give Israel the airspace they need. And also Israel's got incredibly weak leadership right now. So, all I can say is we can see the only way to resolve this is divine intervention. Yes. And that's with the God of Israel intervening in this situation.
Yeah. And that's, I said earlier that God is sovereign in all of this situation. And, we have to search the scriptures to seek to try to understand with what, the scriptures give us what is going on at the present time. But we also have to face the reality that on the human level, we have the world's major superpower has become, in the eyes of many allies, totally untrustworthy. Totally untrustworthy. Whatever agreements previous American administrations have made to support NATO, nations in the Middle East, a lot of folk will think, is this really worth the paper it's even printed on? So we face that, and that's an undermining of confidence. And you undermine confidence, and in this world in which we live, where so many things are interconnected, that has major ripple effects through everything that goes on in our societies, particularly in the Western world, which are, as I say, are so well interconnected. Again, we find, as has happened in the past with both Syria and Iraq, Israel is left to do the dirty work. With their nuclear programs, Israel is left to do the dirty work that the rest of the nations in the world don't want to do. So it falls upon the shoulders of this little nation, no bigger than Wales, to take on board the might of the Iranian regime and all the firepower that it has been developing over the decades. And as you say, quite rightly point out in the end, only God, the God of Israel, the God of the scriptures, is the one who's going to be able to protect his land and his people, which he's promised to do. But that doesn't mean that Israel as a nation state just sits back and let it happen. Because God uses people. God uses people in nations to take his plans forward. And so we may have to live with the very real prospect of the waves, not the ripple effects, the waves that will come crashing out of Iran if Israel has to take some military action to put a stop to this program that the Iranians are, pardon the expression, hell-bent on pursuing at the present time.
Nice, a very good analogy there. And let's have a look at this other excellent CBN news report that looks at the fact that the Iranian regime is weeks away from the doomsday scenario of achieving nuclear breakout.
Ibrahim Raisi takes over as the 8th president of the Islamic regime.
The sanctions imposed against the Iranian nation must be lifted. We will support any diplomatic plan that supports this goal.
Raisi spoke at his swearing-in ceremony, where he touted his country as the true defenders of human rights and a force for peace in the region.
Iran's regional capacities back peace and stability in countries and will only be used to confront threats of domineering and tyrant powers.
Raisi is considered a hardliner, a carbon copy of religious leader Ayatollah Khamenei, and the first Iranian president to be sanctioned by the U.S. even before taking office.
Ibrahim Raisi is called the Butcher of Tehran, actually, because he has a long track record of killing his own people, going back to 1988. You can say that he's probably responsible for at least 10,000 Iranians being executed.
Len Khodorkovsky, a former senior advisor to the U.S. envoy for Iran, says although the Ayatollah is the ultimate decision maker, Raisi won't give up much in talks to reinstate the Iranian nuclear deal, officially known as the JCPOA.
We can expect them to play hardball, and we're seeing them playing hardball right now through their attacks on our interests, through the attacks on an Israeli-owned ship just a few days ago.
Khodorkovsky says it's the Iranian negotiating style.
What they're sensing is that the Biden administration is signaling weakness. They're seeing that there's no price that they have to pay after each of these attacks. And in return, instead of playing hardball, the Biden administration makes more and more concessions.
Israel, the U.S., and U.K. are blaming Iran for the attack on the Israeli-operated oil tanker called Mercer Street that left 2 Europeans dead. Iran denies its involvement. Israel is trying to rally international support for sanctions against Iran, but some 70 countries and the European Union attended Raisi's inauguration. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said they shouldn't be there.
Raisi is the most radical Iranian president so far, and the competition is tough. I call on the European Union. One cannot talk about human rights and at the same time pay homage to a murderer and a hangman who has eliminated hundreds of opponents of the regime.
Israel's Defense Minister Benny Gantz and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid briefed ambassadors from UN Security Council member states on Iran's involvement in the Mercer ship attack and its nuclear plans. Iran has violated all of the guidelines set in the JCPOA and is only around 10 weeks from acquiring weapons-grade materials necessary for a nuclear weapon. Therefore, it is time to act. The world must apply economic sanctions and take operative action against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
The Iranians need to understand that it is impossible to sit peacefully in Tehran and from there ignite the entire Middle East. That is over.
Israel has long said it will not allow Iran to get nuclear weapons, and now that it seems the clock is ticking, Israel will have to decide how far it will go to stop it. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
I see there. Thanks to CBN for that excellent and informative news report put together there, warning of the dangers that Iran faces because it's hell-bent on actually requiring these weapons of mass destruction. Robin, we've seen there, I mean, it doesn't take much of a foreign policy expert to actually work out the fact of the new dynamics in place, that the Iranian Supreme Leader Khomeini, and he holds ultimate total power in Iran, has appointed a hardliner in the new president who was a judge, and like I said before, he's got blood on his hands. He's sentenced to death hundreds, if not thousands, of ordinary Iranians. His name is Ibrahim Raisi. What does this say about the direction that Khomeini wants to take the Iranian regime in, knowing that he's now surrounded himself with hardliners, and they see that their mission to bring about the Mahdi, they're seeing American power implode, and they feel that they have divine guidance and direction in which they're pursuing, is something that the world should really wake up to, is it not?
It is, and we've come almost full circle in some senses back to the point that that we were discussing earlier on in the program, where we have a regime in Tehran that is driven by a particular religious ideology to see the return of the Islamic Mahdi Messiah, at least the Shiite one, the one from their perspective, and that what needs to be done is to create chaos. And I think what is going on here is that the regime in Tehran, particularly the supreme leader, sees the weakness in the new American administration. And they're pushing against, they keep trying to see how far they can push this with each thing. And the appointment, I mean, there was no, you talk about an election to presidency, that was a joke. I mean, all of the candidates are vetted and selected by the supreme leader and an advisory council. And this man has been selected for this post because he fits in with Khamenei's viewpoint, and he will do the supreme leader's bidding, as will the rest of the appointees and the parliament that's in charge of the nation. So they're pursuing a particular goal, but that goal, as you and I know, includes a religious dimension. And so again, I come back to this point. If our politicians do not grasp this aspect of Iranian policy, they're actually missing out on what is driving the whole regime forward. They're not taking into account a vital element of what pushes the Iranian regime to go down what anybody else will think is a totally mad pursuit, getting hold of nuclear weapons. But if you understand it in the context of Shia apocalyptic theology, then it fits perfectly, with sadly all the consequences that you've already itemized.
Absolutely. I just want to read out a quote now, and this is a recent quote, and this is the Iranian foreign minister speaking on Iranian state television, and this is what he said. He said, one of the questions on the foreign policy and the government agenda The other party knows full well that a process of 2 to 3 months is required for the government to establish itself and start taking decisions. So again, we're seeing how the Iranian regime are incredibly good at using delay tactics. No, we can't enter into negotiations with the Americans over our nuclear weapons program because we have a new government in place, and it's going to take 2 to 3 months before our government is up to speed, which gives the Iranian regime that delay time in order to pursue a weapons, while at the same time we see that the Biden administration are appeasing the Iranians at every stage. The US government should say, no, this is unacceptable. We are not going to wait 2 or 3 months before you enter the negotiation table. Either you come to the negotiation table or we'll blow up your nuclear facilities. And we already saw that with the Trump administration, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani was a demonstration of American power that shocked the Iranian regime because he was their main terrorism architect. And without him, they showed a real kind of lack of leadership. And again, I think we need to see, as we saw with the Trump administration, tough measures taken by the against the Iranian regime. And sadly, it's a reflection on history, but I don't think we would be in this situation if President Trump was still occupying the White House.
No, I agree with you. I think that's highly unlikely that we would, and because you are right in saying that with the assassination of that particular leader and 1 or 2 others afterwards, the Iranians were put, on notice that the Trump administration, probably with, I would suspect, the help of the Israelis and others, we're not going to stand for any nonsense. But everything has changed as of last November's American election. And it seems that actually we have 2 interesting dynamics going on here. We have, as you have pointed out, a weak Israeli government made up of 8 political parties that are totally disparate, in their views, but as so often has been pointed out, are held together by the glue that they hate Benjamin Netanyahu and they don't want him back in power. But it teeters on a knife edge as to its continuance. And any major policy decision that does not please the left and the Arab parties, it'll fall apart. You have that coupled with an American administration that is determined to undo as much as possible of what the previous administration did. So anything that would smack of Trump's hard line is an absolute no-no. Whether to Biden or not, who knows, but certainly to the flunkies that are actually controlling and advising and steering the policies. They will do nothing that looks like it's a copy and a tick box against what President Trump did. And so you have this crazy situation unfolding before our very eyes.
Absolutely. And I just want to give a really good quote here. This is a quote made by the Israeli Lieutenant Colonel, retired now, Michael Segal, writing in the JNS, which stands for the Jewish News Syndicate. Brilliant website if you want news and information on Israel and the Middle East. And this is what he writes. He says, this is from the Iranians. He says, from their point of view, Hamas could manage a war against Israel. Hezbollah is growing militarily stronger. The Assad regime has remained in place despite the Syrian civil war. Saddam Hussein, who is Iran's arch enemy, was removed from power. They feel that something big is enabling them. As a result, Iran is becoming bolder. The nuclear program is the anchor that would allow Iran to position itself in its role as it has defined for itself. Becoming a nuclear state would influence all of Iran's tentacles in the region. So here we go, really saying how the Iranian regime feel they're on this divine mission and it's all being completed for them. And I suppose this brings in, onto another level, the kind of spiritual warfare aspect of this, because we see when we read the book of Daniel and how that the archangel Michael had to wrestle against the prince of Persia. In other words, that spirit of principality over Persia. So again, we're seeing that it's those dark forces that are empowering and enabling this regime. but the fact that this regime is hanging on by its thread, because the dire economic situation facing the country, these apocalyptic plagues that have afflicted Iran, such as the bird flu, the floods, and now the driest summer it's had for over 50, 60 years, that actually threatens Iran's water supply. And the people are becoming increasingly angry and more defiant against the regime. And had Trump been in power, I think over the next couple of years, we would have seen the collapse of this dark, demonic regime.
Yes, I totally agree with you, Simon. And I think, we have to add a couple of other things into the mix that have probably developed over the last month or so, in that I read an article a couple of weeks ago where King Abdullah of Jordan has actually decided to open up Jordan to Shiite pilgrims to come into a particular city in the north of Jordan. Now, that's unheard of. And the tribal groups, the Sunni tribal groups in Jordan, are up in arms. They're actually criticizing the king for allowing this, because they see a absolute copy of what happened in Lebanon. Once the Shiites were allowed to come into Lebanon, Hezbollah took over. So there is a threat to the Jordanian monarchy, the Jordanian government, the whole structure of Jordanian society from this move. We've already mentioned the fact that the Saudis have been thrown under a bus because the Americans have removed all the Patriot batteries, and now the Houthis, actually in the last week or so, have been lobbing unmanned aerial bombs and missiles from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. They're threatening Bahrain. So what we are actually beginning to see here is as this guy rightly points out, is a fulfillment of Iran's dream to be the supreme governing authority in a crescent that stretches all the way, from sort of the border with Turkey, right down through Iran, Iraq, Syria, and right down, if you count in Jordan and Saudi Arabia, all the way down into the Persian Gulf. Areas where Iran has the dominant influence. And this is what Iran is working towards. But what's stuck right in the middle of that? Little Israel, gradually becoming surrounded with even more and more enemies. And again, you have to ask the question, what is going on in Washington, D.C. as they observe this and seem to be sitting on their hands and doing nothing? In fact, making the situation worse by some of the actions that they're taking.
No, absolutely, which we really need to bring in how Israel respond to this. So last week we had Israel's public state TV broadcaster called Can 11 report that Israel delivered a new alert to the United States, according to in which it says that the Islamic Republic is approaching nuclear threshold state, meaning that it is a country that gains the operational ability to build nuclear weapons. The message was sent through a number of conversations that senior Israelis held, including Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, Defense Minister Benny Gantz, with their American counterparts. And it seems like the American administration are not really responding, that they are pretty much asleep to this danger. They don't seem concerned about it, which means that the only other option left on the table is for Israel to carry out airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. And we know that they can do it, but they won't really want to do it because they want the backing of the United States if this gets worse. The trouble is that this could then lead to retaliation. We could see Hezbollah firing every missile that they've got at Israel, the same as Hamas. We could see an intifada ignite then in amongst the Palestinian Authority against Israel. We could see Israeli Arabs attacking Israel, and that's just in Israel, let alone the attacks on the Jewish community across Europe and across the United States, with synagogues being targeted. And the level of anti-Semitism, hatred against Israel would be on a level and a scale that we've never even seen before. And not having that backing and support of the United States, this is something that Israel has delayed because they want American help. But the other thing that could limit Israel's ability is that they're now part of American CENTCOM, which they're under American military command. So without America giving the kind of the green light, who knows what situation we could face.
Well, I think that's a valid point that you've made, but I think my reading of you have to ask the question, first of all, how many more warnings does Israel have to give to the West about Iran? You know, we've had at least 2 public warnings. Well, you can guarantee if there have been 2 very public warnings that there is constant badgering, for want of a better word, going on behind the scenes on a regular basis, trying to stir the West into action. But in the end, and I'm really conscious that we are talking about apocalyptic events here. In the end, Israel probably will have to act alone. And whether it's part of CENTCOM, in the end, I think Israel will not care. You know, it's proven that in the past. And if they really believe that their backs are to the wall and that Iran will use, more than threaten, will use nuclear arms against them, I don't think Israel will have any other option but to militarily take out what it can of Iran's nuclear facilities, whatever the cost, because they dare not respond for the sake of the security of the nation and all the people who live in it.
Absolutely.
But you're right, it will unleash a response like we have never seen before in the history of the modern state of Israel. Never.
And we have to also remember that the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, the Holocaust still acts like a dark cloud or shadow that hangs over the state. And so therefore they know that they have one of the world's most powerful armies, certainly have the most powerful army compared to any other European nation. They are the strongest military power in the Middle East. They have one of the best, if not the best, air force in the world. So they are more than capable of taking out Iran's nuclear facilities and dealing with that threat. But the question is, as we got our last few minutes, that as Christians, we need to wake up to this danger. And this is why this program is so important today, is that we need to pray and intercede for Israel and the Jewish people and this situation, that the Iranian regime does not get the nuclear bomb, because if they do, we face a complete doomsday scenario.
Yes.
And the whole world would change, and our own personal security is at threat and at risk.
Yeah. Now, I was thinking about this on the way up on the train, and I put down 3 things that I think that we as believers in Yeshua need to be praying for. We need to be praying for the body of Jesus, the body of Messiah in the Middle East. It is greatly persecuted, no question. But when you look at some of the reports that are coming out, it is also the fastest growing part of the body of Jesus in the world, because it is being persecuted, right? I think on the human level, we cannot, and they cannot, the body of Jesus cannot stop this rollerball that is gaining momentum all the time, but they can reach out to their own fellow citizens and rescue them from being lost eternally. So we need to be praying for the church in the Middle East to have the courage to reach out to their own citizens. And thirdly, I think we need to pray for the government of Israel, because it is in this, walking this knife edge of sort of holding itself together. And yet the book of Proverbs says that the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord, and he can direct it like streams of water. I mean, that's a paraphrase.
Absolutely.
So God can direct the present government, as long as it lasts, to do the right thing for the nation state of Israel and all the people who live in it. And I think there are probably other things that we can pray into, but those are certainly 3 major topics that believers in Yeshua who love Israel and the Jewish people should certainly consider, asking the Lord about and taking to the Lord.
Robin, thank you so much for being my guest on the Middle East Report. Pleasure to see you again in the studios, and this is a dangerous time. And I just want to thank you for watching today's program. We've put out a prophetic warning about the dangers of the Iranian regime being weeks away from having nuclear weapons. We need to pray for Israel's protection. We need to pray for our governments around the world that they would take action, because the situation facing the world is precarious. And the doomsday scenario of Iran having nuclear weapons, it's not even comprehensible how dangerous this is. So let's stay awake, let's stay alert, and let's pray. So thank you for watching this urgent Middle East report.